right, everyone, let's get underway. Hope you enjoyed your lunch, courtesy of Water Care. You know the drill. There is hand sanitizer on the tables. Please use lots of it and keep the Prime Minister happy. Let's get underway now. This session is the Planning for Outcomes session. We'll focus on resource management reforms. Now, the Resource Management Act was passed in 1991. Now, 30 years on, there is a general consensus that it hasn't hit the mark as our environment has degraded and our built environment has become unaffordable. So Dean Kimpton and Amelia Linzey were both on the Randerson panel, which reviewed what is broken in our resource management system and proposed how to fix it. So please welcome Dean Kimpton and Amelia Linzey.
All right, thank you very much. It's good to be here and it's good to share some of the findings of the panel. They've only given us 20 minutes, so we're going to have to dash through this. 20 minutes for what feels like hundreds of thousands of hours of thinking and discussion, eh, Amelia? Yeah. But really delighted to be able to share some reflections. Cabinet appointed an independent panel, of which Amelia and I were both members. So was Rachel Brooking, Roman Peart, Kevin Prime, and of course Tony Randerson, who I think his toes curl every time that it's called the Randerson Report, but maybe underneath he's secretly proud. I've just got to clear up one thing. I got many pieces of feedback from those that know me. I am not a planner. And I'm not a lawyer, I am a civil engineer and I am proud of it. And it was awesome to be on a panel that's looking at planning legislation. So look, we're going to talk about the drivers for change. We'll touch briefly on terms of reference, the legislative proposal, and then between Amelia and I we will share reflections on, in a bit more detail around each of the proposed acts. Can I just clear up one thing, and that's around the terms of reference. Look, they were broad, they were inclusive, but there was two things that weren't included, and I thought it's worth just highlighting those, and amongst everything that I could have said was in. First of all, reform of local government was excluded, although I suspect if you read the report you'll find that we've made some subtle suggestions about the reform of local government. And Tony goes as far and as forward to say that 78 local authorities and over 100 regional and district plans and 5 million people doesn't seem to make sense. And then the rights of Maori as they relate to fresh water, both were exclusions. So what were some of those drivers for change? I just want to touch on a few, and I'll also invite Amelia when I finish just to give a few of her reflections. Look, as a panel, we needed to rapidly identify what we considered the problem statement, but also the opportunity statement was. And we did that through the Issues and Opportunities report. Many of you should have, if you haven't read it, go back and do so. As I reflect on it, the key drivers were there is an evidence base for continued degradation of our natural and physical environment. We see urban areas struggling with how to handle growth and the related infrastructure provision. We saw that managing the effects of resource use was driving us to a lowest common denominator rather than taking an outcomes-based approach. We saw a bias to the status quo. So we weren't allowed to change anything, even if the science and even if the intergenerational effects were taking us in a different direction. And the RMA had become unworkable in some respects because of the amendments. Not all of them were consistent with each other. So we're at the point in time after 30 years where we needed to do something. But that's also accompanied by a lot of opportunity. The opportunity for strategic planning, the opportunity for taking that outcomes-based approach, opportunity for recognising Te Tiriti and our partnership relationship with Māori. So there's a whole lot of things inside there that we saw as both challenges and opportunities, dealing with complexity, simplify, looking at capability and capacity across the sector to help us plan for and deliver what is complex solutions. So, yep, the existing, Did you want anything you wanted to add? I just went...
So you can imagine the panel dynamics now.
I am looking at the clock.
No, the only thing I was going to add in there about thinking about the considerations for infrastructure, I think the two observations I would make about that driver for change, and we can have a big argument about whether the existing system is an implementation error or a structure of the Act error, but I think we can't dispute the outcomes aren't delivering what we want. And I think that was the other perspective that I just wanted to reflect on. We're not aligning, the Act is not aligning with the community's expectations, whether that's infrastructure providers' expectations or the communities in which are being impacted by that infrastructure or those environments. So it was those things in combination, I think, and that was just the only additional point I had from yours, Dean.
That was a very nice additional point, thank you. Look, I just want to talk about the current state. Simple diagram there. One of the first issues we needed to tackle was, what do we think that future architecture of the legislation looked like? And the panel landed in 2 or 3 main schools of thought. The first one was our proposal. We'll touch on that, so I won't say any more. The second one was that you have separate acts, one dealing with the natural environment and one dealing with the built environment. We also had urban and rural land split. We didn't know how to deal with that, so we discarded that quickly. But the panel was unanimous and got to that point very quickly. That we felt it was still leading edge to take an integrated approach to how you deal with all of these issues that need to be, from strategic planning through into how you deal with outcomes as a result of ongoing development. Which probably puts me in strong contrast to some of Hamish or Infrastructure New Zealand's position on this matter, which you may have heard before. But quite frankly, we didn't care, and Hamish and I have had many debates on the matter, because we think that the Strategic Planning Act does deal with the very question that he's challenged us with. So in our view, to split would weaken, and it would take us backwards. So we came up with this, and we'll talk about the Strategic Planning Act, the Natural Built Environments Act, and the Managed Retreat one. This was, in our view, the preferred combination, okay? The Strategic Planning Act, so just to touch on that very briefly, it sets the long-term, its objective is to set long-term strategic goals and facilitate that integration of resource planning and infrastructure planning and delivery across and integrate across those other pieces of legislation. So you do have this complexity of Local Government Act, LTMA, the Climate Change Response Act. It also, and we had a lot of discussion around this, we also tried to give it the additional oomph of addressing the funding component to that. So you can have a rhetoric inside a strategic plan, but the rhetoric has to be matched with agreement around how you will fund and finance that. So we've tried to bring that into that strategic plan so we are more confident about delivery. We've also addressed, as you can see, there are a number of other challenges around mandatory elements within it, especially to deal with landside and the interface with the CMA. Given some real strength to taking a regional approach, we've given ministerial flexibility around sequencing and timing and how you handle that. But the Strategic Planning Act is designed for communities to plan out for what they need into the future. And on that note, I will hand over to Amelia. Thank you.
Kia ora, thank you. So I was the planner in the room on the panel. So we had 3 lawyers, I think. Environment Commissioner, Mr Prime as an engineer, Dean as an engineer, and myself as the sole planner in the room, but I think we put up a good fight. And look, I'm going to talk about a topic that I literally could talk about for about 2 hours in 8 minutes. So lean forward and I'll take a breath and we'll go. So the proposal is that the MBEA would replace the Act, and as Dean has said, it would retain some of those really key principles about integration and sustainability and the well-being of present and future generations. I think it is arguably moving from a Sustainable Management Act, which is what we had in 1991, to one that's about sustainable development. And I'm going to sort of put some case together about why I think that time is right for that change. And it's really about working towards setting outcomes. Now, it's not the legislation that will set those outcomes, it is government. It's local government and central government that will set those outcomes, and our national directions and plans we maintain are the instruments to do that. But it is about setting those outcomes and targets to get there, and how that is different, I suppose, from our current system. And to me as a geographer, before I move to the world of planning, it's analogous to, we've worked in a system now for 30 years where we've said our destination is Taupo, but the way we've evaluated whether we're getting there is proposal by proposal. We've asked ourselves, is this getting us any further away from Taupo? Or, that's all we've done from an effects assessment. Are we making this a little bit worse? Is it, substantially worse? And that's how we've been making our decision making. The fundamental difference with this Act is it's about setting a direction. We want to get to Taupo, mapping those routes, and then making decisions, asking ourselves the question, is this getting us closer to Taupo? I think simply that's the big change in terms of the legislative reform that we're proposing. A few other things I just wanted to touch on in terms of key element and change. It's about redefining the environment, and that natural and built environments is core to that, but also introducing the concept of te mana o te taiao into the definition for the environment. So it is saying we have a New Zealand environmental ethic that we should be proud of. It's a Māori one and it's a European one, and it's a combination of those and embedding that philosophy. So it's trying to address some of those challenges that Dean touched on at the beginning. And it's a shift away, and I think this is also critical at the moment in terms of where we are for infrastructure provision, for urbanism, and certainly for climate change. It's a shift away from the presumption of stationarity. So no longer are we assessing and assuming that the status quo is the environmental outcome we want, that our existing condition is the environmental outcome we want. It is that target and outcome that we're driving to. And then finally, it's about bringing in a number of other changes that respond to some of those drivers, providing improvements for certainty, reducing complexity, and really ensuring and delivering some consistency for projects across the country. And again, I think that's central to infrastructure. Just really quickly touching on how we've done each of those. One is absolutely beefing up the amount of national direction that we're looking for. And I think this goes to some of the comments and criticisms that we've heard. I think there has been a lack of national direction provided, and that is where outcomes can be really brought to the fore. So to me, we've identified it's a ministerial duty to set a number of those national directions, and those national directions will cover a much broader range than they currently do now. So not just the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement, but importantly, how the principles of the treaty will be given effect to, and how local councils, and that, to me that's addressing a massive gap that we've seen in our system, each local council trying to interpret how they're going to give effect to those principles, or in fact whether even local government should be giving, taking a responsibility of the Crown and delivering those principles. The intent is a lot of that legislation will be set through national direction. The second point to achieve some of that consistency is about making sure that that national direction deals with the conflicts that are in it at the time of its development. So again, a point that Hamish, I think, made in his presentation earlier, we know we currently have a system where conflicts are left to being dealt with at resource consenting stage or at proposal development stage. And the intent is with this that those conflicts are resolved through that national direction and up front. And then the third is about having some ownership in terms of how that's developed, and particularly about MFE being the mechanism or the instrument, the agent, to deliver that, and Board of Inquiry being the mechanism. So we're getting some science into the consideration and development of those policy statements. The second massive change is about the planning framework itself, and again, Dean alluded to this. It's about preparing combined plans and reducing the number. So at the moment, we've got over 100 plans, and that is really a huge drive to me about inconsistency and complexity in the system. It also gives rise to the poor consistency that we have in those plans. So you can have, I'm doing some work for emergency services providers and community hubs at the moment, and that ranges from a permitted activity in some jurisdictions to a non-complying activities in others, in effectively what is the same zone. And that is to do with how territorial authorities are perceiving and managing acts, not on the effects that they're having or the outcomes that we're wanting to deliver. And the third, the responsiveness is variable as well, and some of that is attributed to the capacity of councils, and we understand that. And so this proposal, it is a big and brave proposal, and it certainly will require big culture change, is to amalgamate and require those councils to work collaboratively in a combined plan process. And as Dean said, it is not restructuring local government, but it is perhaps setting a different way of working between some of those councils around the country. And the only other thing I wanted to note, it is 14 of those, so there are some unitary authorities there that also get brought into the requirement for that collaborative working. Getting close to the end now, because I can see the clock ticking down, some of the changes in consents. And the 2 or 3 big drivers that I wanted to make a point on here in terms of infrastructure provision, it's really about providing some certainty on notification and getting rid of some of that discretion, because I think that has taken a huge amount of energy out of our system. 95% of our consents aren't notified, and yet more than 50% of our time processing consents is often the decision to notify or not. So providing certainty on that and providing direction on where it is, removing some of the consent activity statuses, in particular non-complying activity, reducing the number of consents through that combined planning process, and also introducing an alternate dispute resolution pathway, so a non-appealable pathway for consents of defined character or neighbourhood dispute kind of issues in the urban environment. I did really briefly want to touch on some of the status quo and change issues, and again, this is just touching again on a comment that Dean was talking to about how we can no longer accept stationarity. We can no longer accept that the baseline for our environmental consideration should be the condition we're in. And I think urbanism has been a big driver of that, and the MPS for Urban Development has tried to respond to that recently. And the other one that we're facing at the other end in the physical environment is the climate change response that we need to make. And so there are a number of changes that we are recommending in respect of allocation and in respect of rethinking some of the existing use rights and permitted baseline considerations in the legislation that are quite substantial to that change, and I just wanted to highlight those. And then finally, I think, systems oversight. And again, I think this is an area of great weakness in our current regime, our current resource management system, and there are some significant gaps. And we make a number of recommendations that tries to re-emphasise how the system is monitoring progress towards those outcomes, rather than monitoring the processes that are established by the legislation itself. And we've made, again, some recommendations about how that could be integrated and work collaboratively to try and address some of the capability and capacity gaps. I won't touch on that one because I know that I've got to give Dean enough time to talk about climate change, which is also a really significant part of the recommendations.
Except to say that we did spend a lot of time on this subject, didn't we?
I know.
Yeah, and we've got, I think, some quite strategic advice here about how this should be organised. So I've just done a slide for you, haven't I?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. Right, can we just, we're in home stretch now, we've got 2 or 3 slides left, and then hopefully we've whetted your appetite. Climate change and hazards were also a significant part of our discussion. This is a reflection of New Zealand, but also what we see happened in the past, but also what we see happening into the future in relation to climate change related effects. Look, the Natural Built Environments Act has been designed as per our report to deal with a reduction of risk and natural hazards. So how do we do that, and how do we do that in a legislative context? How do we build, improve resilience to the effects of climate change with a focus on adaptation? How do we, or requiring us to address, reduce the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and promote activities that mitigate for those emissions? So we've come up with a number of recommendations. They include mandatory national directions. Amelia's touched on those, but particularly focus on climate change mitigation, adaptation. And we expect the Strategic Planning Act itself to consider how land use and changes in that land use need to be managed as we think into the future around how we plan cities and communities, the infrastructure they need, and how our land or areas become increasingly vulnerable. What will we do? How do we give people and communities time to change and adapt? Okay, alongside of that is also protection of vulnerable ecosystems. How do we want to do that? We expect that thinking to occur through the Strategic Planning Act. Which leads us to this issue of managed retreat and climate change. What we tried to put this into the Natural Built Environment Act. We tried to put it into the Climate Change Response Act. What we found is we couldn't. Somebody else might be able to crack that nut, and all power to them. What we, in effect, have come up and recommended is that a specific piece of legislation that allows us to deal with how we manage retreat from vulnerable areas, how we think about how that might be funded or the liability associated with those issues, so that local government and central government can move together more positively in resolving those issues. Okay, we don't have anything that allows us in a reasonable fashion to chart a course forward. We're doing it in an ad hoc, bespoke fashion to date. So we've made some quite specific recommendations once again around how this should be treated, managed retreat and climate change adaptation. I want to finish on my last slide. I've got 11 seconds to do so. The last slide's all about transition. I started off, look, the transition, quite simply, is just to get on with it. I mean, we've been sitting on this one, it's been debated for 10 years. It should not be a question of if, it's a case of when. So on that note, I think, Lesley, we look at you and say the MFE, charge on. I was really pleased to see David Parker was saying they're going to charge on. Actually, from a panel point of view, we don't mind quite where we land, but we want to land, okay? So there is a lot of things to be thought about. We can start transition now. We don't need to get all the legislation in place. We can start to think about culture and capability and do all of those things that we know will come, because 30 years ago we had a lot of practice at it. So on that note, we will finish. We're 35 seconds late, so I think that's pretty good. And thank you so much for listening.
I reckon that's a record, 35 seconds. Nicely done, guys. We face, as we've heard, increasing degradation of our environment. We're limited in resolving that by the RMA and the amendments, which too often battle each other. And so has come the call from Dean. We heard simplify, simplify, simplify. That's led to the recommendations we've heard today from Dean. I'm not a planner or a lawyer. I'm a civil engineer, Kimpton. And Amelia, I am a planner who is in the room, Linzey. Let's get on with it, they say. Thank you both very much. Now, a few weeks ago, Infrastructure New Zealand did a remote interview with Bridget Rosewell, who is a commissioner with the UK National Infrastructure Commission and who sat on a task force into planning reform in England. She was unable to give a live presentation given the time difference at this hour. So this video is an edited version of that conversation, which went into depth on various planning and infrastructure issues. So here's Bridget Rosewell.
Good afternoon. Good to be here. Well, the government has decided that they really need to try and simplify what is actually become a really, really complicated system in the UK. A system both in terms of how you produce a plan for your local area, but equally how you get planning permission for individual developments. And the result of that is that it's pretty known that we've got a housing crisis. Housing is very expensive, in some places almost impossibly expensive, and that something needs to be done about that. The general principle is central government sets the rules, the framework. Local government produces a local plan, and that's done by the local planning authority. There's a clue. They produce a plan which has to show that there is sufficient space for what is known as need, both for housing and employment land and everything else. And then individuals, developers, people, whatever, can come forward with proposals for particular developments. They make a planning application. The local authority decides whether that application is okay or not. they can accept it or not. If they say it's no good, then you can appeal against that. And that can go all the way up to a public inquiry and so on. There is also a system for public inquiries for the actual plan. And that is supposed to be a plan for a 5-year period. About half of local authorities don't have a valid plan because the whole process takes so extraordinarily long that by the time they've got to the point of having an inquiry for their plan, it's already out of date. And they have to start again. We were trying to come up with ways that you could make the system more comprehensible to ordinary people, more engaging. So we propose that for your local plan, it's a much simpler process with simpler ways of defining the areas for development, and that you had to have engagement before you produced your plan with your local residents and indeed other people who were interested, so that hopefully you could produce a plan, still a plan-led system, which is what ours is known to be, a plan-led system where you might actually have valid plans for most places most of the time, and people would be much clearer before they made an application whether it would be accepted or not. Our proposal is that in your plan, you should identify 3 kinds of areas, not calling them zones, because zones has a whole other set of stuff around it. One of your zones should be the areas which are suitable for development, and you might have some design codes and consult about design and the sort of things that people might actually like to have in their area. I think that's actually one of the problems about community acceptability. One of your areas would be the places where you're not going to have any development, whether it's a green belt or whether it's an area of outstanding natural beauty, or whether it's simply something which the community has agreed is really not suitable, a floodplain, for example. And then a third area where there's some development would be suitable, but it would be more case by case, and everybody again would have a chance to say something about an individual proposal. I don't think that we had a specific proposal for that. What we're trying to do is just put in place the building blocks which would enable you to get to a more effective, more engaging and simpler system with fewer hoops that expensive hoops that everybody has to jump through before they can get a permission. Now, as you do that, you would also make it easier to bring development forward, but also there would be less incentive. It would be a quicker process. There should be less incentive to land bank, to have stuff just sitting there in the hope that eventually, or in the expectation, eventually you'll need to develop it. And as the system becomes more flexible, eventually, then that should help manage land prices. Because otherwise that's a market. So, you're just trying to make the market more effective. I don't think we do that terrifically well. We've got better, and we've got particularly better in cities where there's been a move to mayors and city deals and devolution, because in a more devolved system, there's better ability of the business community to engage with the political community and the other civic institutions, and to build a shared vision of what they want the city to be like. If you do it all top down in London, it's all being done to, not done by. Done by is what matters. The affordable housing question exists particularly in the areas of high demand. So one way to address that is to actually identify places where people would like to see, or would be willing to see at any rate, high quality, well-designed extensions or new settlements, And that in itself, by increasing supply, will help. This is the economist's answer after all. Increase supply, the price will be moderated, or at least not very so fast, and housing will become more affordable. I don't think you just increase affordable housing by saying you must produce a particular proportion. There will continue to be pressure. And I think you just have to accept this is not a problem that you kind of completely solve, but it's certainly a problem that you can mitigate. Well, I think you do two things. One is, well, the role of the National Infrastructure Commission is to think longer term. So we've got a 20, 30-year horizon that we're trying to generate an assessment for infrastructure need, which then also thinks about a vision for development and so on at a very high level, not constraining it to particular places. But we're certainly thinking like that. And I think the other thing is to encourage and devolve to cities and city regions where they can develop their own vision, and they are doing that. There are some ways in which you can raise more funds at local authority level. I think that you should make that easier. And we should allow, for example, local sales taxes to be, we have a national system, the value-added tax system, and I see no reason why you shouldn't say, if this amount of value-added tax is being raised in your region, you can keep 1% of it or whatever for local purposes. We used to have a system for regional planning in the UK, and that was dismantled in the early 2000s, rightly, in my view. So I don't think it makes sense to have one plan. Certainly, the idea of a plan which you are going to deliver. Now, it's certainly possible to have some regional visions, and you can encourage people to come up with a vision for a bigger area. But we've really got to distinguish between the vision and the plan. So you may need planning, but the plan immediately becomes a straitjacket, because it's all about what you can't do as much as what you can do. And over a 20-year period, life evolves. It has to keep changing all the time. And I, in some ways, hate the word plan. It smacks to me of the kind of central planning. We know what you need. We're going to give it to you, and woe betide you if you don't want it, because we know better than you what you want. I so disagree with that. The whole point of market systems is that they allow new stuff to happen. They allow you to explore what people really want. And if you have it centralised, and the UK is one of the most centralised systems in the world, if you have it too centralised, you'll never discover that. You never allow for that innovation. You never allow local stuff to happen. And I think that's a really, really serious error. Keep it simple. Think of ways in which you engage local people in the making of the plan, and be very aware that it will not survive contact with reality, because plans don't. So you have also to think about how within you have a longer term vision, but you're going to need to be adjusting all the time what actually goes on.
I love that. It will not survive contact with reality. Good thing to bear in mind going forward. So, of course, Bridget Rosewell is a commissioner with the UK National Infrastructure Commission who sat on the task force into planning reform in England, talking about the wins and challenges of the changes they've made on the planning front. We're going to turn now from the UK to Australia. How is Sydney, the largest city in our corner of the world, approaching planning? Dr. Sarah Hill is joining us now live from Australia to describe their approach to planning a new city of sorts in Western Sydney. So please welcome Dr. Sarah Hill. Coming up.
Hello, wonderful to be here today. So thank you very much for welcoming me in such a wonderful way. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which I meet today, the Barramarrigal people of the Dougherty clan. And we have a short time together, but I'm really excited about sharing with you the work we've been doing here in Greater Sydney, and certainly the progression we've made from the concept of planning reform through to delivery. And I understand that this is certainly something that is topical at the moment and topical in New Zealand around getting the best planning system. And indeed it is in many jurisdictions. So I'm going to share with you a little bit about our journey here in New South Wales, but also critically how that's led to some real outcomes on the ground in the work that we're doing now. So I'm presenting today in my capacity as the CEO of the Western Parkland City and the Deputy Secretary in New South Wales Treasury. But formerly, I was the inaugural CEO of an organisation called the Greater Sydney Commission. And the Greater Sydney Commission was established really very much as a key outcome of planning reform. So I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey about the work of the Greater Sydney Commission and certainly how it's led to the Western Parkland City and where I am today. So planning reform was a key element for the New South Wales government about 7 or 8 years ago. And like many jurisdictions, it started with this concept of streamlining processes and ensuring a more effective and efficient system. But one of the key things that came out of that, and indeed one of the key elements that became very common in the lexicon of Sydney-siders, was this need for a better alignment of growth and infrastructure. And certainly we were finding in Sydney, on the boom of a very strong housing market, we were building everything everywhere and playing catch up in an infrastructure context. So the Greater Sydney Commission was established to set the big picture vision for our city, but also to ensure that alignment of growth and infrastructure. And I'll share with you a little bit about the work that we did in that space. Importantly, the Greater Sydney Commission was set up in a very strong governance framework. Indeed, it had the Secretaries of Planning, of Education, of Transport and Health, as well as Treasury all sitting on its board. But it also had 3 thematic commissioners: an environment, a social and an economic commissioner, all reporting to a chief commissioner. There were also 6 district commissioners that represented the districts of the Greater Sydney area. So collectively, a very strong group of experts came together around the table. So that governance was key, but also was this overarching ambition to work together to do things better. So for the first time in New South Wales history, we not only prepared a plan and a strategy for the city, but we did it concurrently and released it on the same day with Infrastructure New South Wales Infrastructure Strategy, or the State Infrastructure Strategy for SIS, together with the Transport Plan for the state. So these 3 elements come together in that circle that you see on the screen, aligning that land use and transport, at least in plan context. But we knew growing forward that there was one thing to have a plan, we needed to integrate that through the system. So the Greater Sydney Region Plan, the big overarching vision for our city, was then fed down into district plans and indeed into local planning strategies for each of our 33 councils in Greater Sydney. We also came up with what we call the single biggest game changer for Greater Sydney, and that's a Place Infrastructure Compact. So a fancy title for what effectively was a mechanism to work across the 24 state government agencies to identify existing capacity in infrastructure, capacity for growth and change, and efficiently and effectively where growth could be located. And fundamentally it taught us that there were some locations that were far more cost effective from a development point of view, and others that many developers or other interests were very keen to develop but would in fact create a significant financial liability for the government. So the PIC, or the Place Infrastructure Compact, is a very important information and decision support tool for the New South Wales government. Now, it's not without its contentions. Indeed, with anything, we find sequencing of development and prioritising infrastructure to be certainly a topical matter for discussion, but it really is a means of better understanding the true cost of change and the true cost of outcomes of growth as compared to what can be funded from a development contribution. So the Commission got to the stage where we had a hierarchy of planning across our state government agencies, but also certainly across our infrastructure agencies, working with them together with some real mechanisms to understand how to tie the dots together. The challenge was then going from that vision, going from that information to pragmatic delivery. And so part of that was a role that the Greater Sydney Commission had, working with state and Commonwealth government and local government to negotiate what we call the city deal. And I'm going to share with you a little bit about that further and some of the outcomes of the city deal. But in essence, really going from an original concept of planning reform and the Greater Sydney Commission being one of those reform factors coming out of that, really building on this concept of a need to align growth and infrastructure through to a complete hierarchy of planning documents, really selling the picture and the growth targets of the city going forward. Now I'm going to drill down a little bit into place. And this is important because one of the key changes we created as the Greater Sydney Commission was to focus around place. When we listened to our citizens in preparing the plan, we found that the Greater Sydney region had a substantial variation in place. So we have the Eastern Harbour City, that blue area that you see on the map, and so many people internationally recognise as Sydney CBD, its finance centre, its harbour bridge, its opera house, focused around the coast and its beaches. But we also have a really important developing heart of Greater Sydney, the geographic heart being the Greater Parramatta area, which we call the Central River City, focused around the Parramatta River. And then to our west, an area which has traditionally been less well invested in, an area that's traditionally been more affordable from a housing point of view, but certainly one that was in deficit in terms of jobs per resident, and that is our broader Western Parkland city. And that's the area that I'm going to drill down into today. Indeed, as you probably put two and two together, is the nature of the organisation that I am now leading, the Western Parkland City Authority, and our strong focus there. But I also want to tell a little bit of the story about the city. And sorry, we've moved a little bit quickly through the slides, but I do want to take you through the story of our three cities because it helps to put it in context. The first is the overarching challenges and opportunities that it presents. Substantial growth. Indeed, we're forecasting by 2056 there will be the city the size of London in terms of population, 8 million people. That means that we need to generate an additional 735,000 new dwellings over the next 20 years, and that's a doubling of the number of dwellings that we have. And indeed, over the last few years, we've been accelerating at a rate of over 40,000 new dwellings in the city per annum. We compare that to 15 to 20 in London, it's pretty extraordinary growth. But we also have to generate jobs. And this is key across our three cities, given what we call the smashed avocado line, the goat's cheese curtain, or the red rooster line, whereby we certainly have a disparity in terms of socioeconomic opportunities and indeed household outcomes. So by that I mean certainly the northeastern part of our city has the vast majority of educational facilities, tertiary, higher performing primary schools, but also the lion's share of our finance and high value jobs. We needed to rebalance the city. Frankly, we have hundreds of thousands of people living in our Western Parkland city who are travelling to those opportunities in the eastern city every day. Not only generating traffic, but also putting a load on their lifestyles and their ability to recreate, to exercise, spend time with their family, adding stress and certainly adding congestion. We knew we needed an approach and a strategy for the city that rebalanced it. And instead of always looking to the east, we wanted to make sure that we also generated jobs in the west. And that is a strong focus of the work that we are now leading. And we have a strong and significant job target of an additional 200,000 jobs over the next 20 years in the Parkland city to start to address that change. But it's not just about the volume of jobs, it is about the quality of jobs. And I'll be sharing a little bit with you shortly on that one. So that rebalancing is critical, but the last thing I'd flag is the challenges that are created by building a city the size of Canberra, or indeed 2 Canberras, in the next 20 years. And building it in a basin that is flood liable and indeed one of the hottest places in the Australian continent. We reached 50 degrees in the Western Parkland city last year, presenting new challenges around how we manage water, how we manage tree canopy cover and keep our city cool. So I referenced earlier the city deal. Well, the Western Sydney City Deal is a 3 or tripartite levels of government agreement around how we're going to improve our city. Starting off with that big picture plan that I referenced through to the Western City District Plan that really led to the 38 deliverables of the Western Sydney City Deal. And those commitments are very, very strong and very prominent. Indeed, one of them is a $11 billion rail line from one part of our city in the north to the south that has never experienced a north-south transport connection before. A substantial joint commitment by the Commonwealth and the state government that together reshapes our city. So we're into the city shaping infrastructure, we're into vision-led infrastructure, not just a predict and provide model, which we've traditionally experienced. So our new Western Sydney Airport Metro is a city shaper, and the first bit of infrastructure that's been planned for our city of that scale and magnitude that wasn't on the plans of Bradfield over 100 years ago. A real catalyst of change for us is our second airport, or the Western Sydney Airport, our 24/7 airport in the Sydney Basin, which is a game changer for us and which was really a huge catalyst for the city deal. But also critically, a livability program. So we can generate jobs, but we also need to create places where our people can live and enjoy themselves and get out of the heat. And so $190 million was jointly funded across those 3 levels of government for key projects in parks, public spaces, inland beaches, and a range of wonderful opportunities. And last but not least, a digital action plan, which is being led by one of our 8 city deal councils in the Parkland city. I'll come back to that one too, because it's a key element of our delivery and vision. So I'm going to zoom in now to the Western Parkland city, and if you recall my 3 cities map, you'll recall that yellow area on the Western Parkland city, and so that's the area that you see now in green before you. And you'll see that there is a red outline in the middle of that map and in the middle of our 8 city deal councils, which relates to what we call the Aerotropolis, 11,000 hectares of land, of which about half we've recently rezoned for employment uses. So an enormous amount of capacity has been generated through the planning system in the last year through a local government group that we've set up so that there's collective buy-in working with the state government to deliver on planning outcomes. And you'll see the enormity of the scale of that 11,000 hectares when we overlay it on Sydney CBD and Tokyo and indeed Auckland. It's no small area. But it is a key catalyst for change for us. And so the organisation, the Western Parkland City Authority, was originally focused around that 11,000 hectares. But it became quickly apparent the need to really connect the dots with infrastructure and planning across that whole area, and certainly to ensure that we have that alignment of growth and infrastructure that I spoke to. So in expanding the authority from the 11,000 hectares of the area around the airport, We now have an area of 800,000 hectares, a large part of which is national park. And indeed, a large part of which is urban, about 100,000 hectares are urban. And so we have this great ambition to build a new city, a new high quality, 22nd century focused city within a parkland. So our sort of three key areas, just like three cities, and we always like R3s, our three key focus points are around a green, a connected and advanced parkland city. So building a city in a parkland, but also not only building back better post-COVID, but building back greener. A connected parkland city, so not only connected internationally through a new 24/7 airport or new metro lines, but digitally connected, supporting less advantaged communities, particularly in the southwestern parts of our city, and also ensuring a new approach to how we think about connections across Greater Sydney, linking into our Eastern Harbour and Central River cities. And last but absolutely not least, advanced. So we have a very strong focus around advanced industry, skills, research, and other ecosystems, particularly in light of the importance of the supply chain and the challenges we've experienced through COVID, but also critically cybersecurity. And this is a growing challenge and a growing opportunity for a new greenfield location where we're going to focus on defence, aerospace, and aviation industries. I could talk a lot more about that, but I'm conscious of time. As an organisation, we also have a strong focus around delivery. So going from running the Strategic Planning Authority for Greater Sydney, it's important that we have a strong focus around investment and delivering on that vision, around coordination. So we have a chief city coordinator who ties together the pieces of the puzzle. We have an investment attraction arm, inviting international businesses and encouraging them to come and locate within our city in those key industries, but also working with the local councils. So there's a bottom-up and a top-down approach to driving job generation. We also have a range of commitments such as the city deal, but innovations such as multi-utilities, better ways to co-locate and integrate service delivery across our various services in the Parkland city. I'll come on to those in short a little bit too. But what is very important is how our partners work together. And so we have government partners and we also have industry partners. And so they are key to us in not only tying together the commitments into delivery, but as I said, generating jobs and outcomes. I'm just going to pause for a moment here and reflect on some of what a couple of key deliverables are as an authority, and really taking that vision of a parkland city to the next level. And so we've created this concept of the blueprint. In the Parkland city, we have capacity for over 500,000 new dwellings. But capacity is one thing. The reality is, are we servicing those areas? Are we generating the infrastructure required to make them genuinely wonderful places to live and to work? And are we certainly creating the best environments that we can? So our blueprint takes that vision for a Parkland city and starts to map out those growth areas that we've committed to and that indeed we've rezoned through the planning system to ensure that capacity is created. Now it's about backing in the infrastructure, making sure that we're sequencing it so that we're not providing a school in one area and to the north providing a metro line, that we're doing it in a very consistent and coherent way. So this is a technical document, again, formed by the 24 state government agencies I work with, the 8 councils and the Commonwealth, to bring that story in a very visual and a very technical way forward. Digital twins, physical documents, and old school maps, but really critically as well, we're looking at models so that people can understand the scale of the city that we're dealing with. And some of our foundation partners who we brought into the city are preparing those models for us with 3D printing. So old school approaches to understanding context and geography developed through new ways. An economic development strategy is another one of our key priorities, and particularly now more than ever, we recognise how important the Western city is to the economic recovery of not only Greater Sydney, but New South Wales and indeed Australia. So an economic development strategy on the back of COVID that recognises not only the strengths of our city, but also those areas that we're targeting. And as I mentioned, a strong focus around defence and aviation, additive metals, additive manufacturing and advanced manufacturing, research and prototyping, going from idea through to delivering Parkland City. Also, importantly, creating an economic focus that complements our two other cities, our Eastern Harbour and our Central River City. Our Eastern Harbour having a strong focus around finance and tech, and our Central River City a strong focus around government, biomedical advancements and health. Now, tied within together with our blueprint and our economic development strategy, which reinforce and back each other in, a critical element of city planning, is the need for skills and education and training. And certainly what we've heard from our international foundation partners in our city is the need to ensure that when they invest in our city and as they're investing in our city, that there's sufficient skills in education and certainly those skills that are required for the businesses that they have. So robotics, data management, all of these elements that new and advanced businesses need, we need to ensure that our citizens are well trained and prepared and creating the opportunities for these connections to these businesses. So we're designing a new model in conjunction with our foundation partners, our international businesses, that are fit for purpose for the needs of their businesses, at the same time as raising the bar on the education opportunities for our Parkland City citizens. So there's three of our key overarching city priorities. We also have some pretty critical place-based priorities around the Aerotropolis cores. So you'll recall that line on a map, the 11,000 hectares in the Parkland City. Now that's our Aerotropolis, and within that we have a 115 hectare site that we're generating opportunities on as our new Parkland City core. And so this is a new area that we've just gone to our citizens to get their ideas on a new name for a new place. But I'm also going to share with you some of the early ideas and opportunities that we have for developing on that site. And so this is our first one. This is the Advanced Manufacturing Research Facility based on a similar model in Sheffield. And really back to that point around research and innovation, bringing lots of international partners together with those wonderful businesses that are already based in our city, and working through opportunities, sharing information, sharing machinery to translate ideas and concepts through to prototypes and commercial outcomes. So the Advanced Manufacturing Research Facility is something we as a New South Wales government are leading on in partnership with an array of different businesses, our Japanese partners, our UK partners, our French partners, our German partners, to deliver this wonderful facility, which will be one of our key anchor tenants in the Aerotropolis. Australia's National Science Agency will be another one of our key anchor tenants, and as a scientist I'm always really excited by this slide and the labs of the future, but also the critical work our CSIRO friends are doing at the moment in terms of the COVID vaccine and the great progress that's being made there. So the AMRF alongside our science agency is a wonderful combination for the future economic recovery and strength of our Parkland City. We also have some new ideas around agribusiness. So a new 24/7 airport allows us to focus around agricultural goods and exports, and this enormous opportunity that is presented and created there. And certainly a radical shift in how we do business in New South Wales, changing the digital supply chain for agricultural exports and imports, but also radically reducing the amount of time from farm gate to consumer plate down to 36 hours to almost any location in the world. And so this idea of an agri-port and an agri-business precinct is something we're shortly going to market to develop and to start to support significant change around our city in collaboration with some key landowners and stakeholders in the Aerotropolis. And last but not least, I mentioned this concept of multi-utilities. Now, we have a a lot of utility junkies, as I call them, here in New South Wales, who are fascinated by the opportunity of better co-locating and integrating service delivery, but also the commercial opportunities that this creates. And it'd be remiss of me not to also flag the importance that a multi-utility approach can create for supporting a Parkland City approach, and indeed avoiding many of the challenges that we're now experiencing in developing infrastructure across Greater Sydney, of the need to rip up roads and to augment services every time that we try to build new infrastructure. Indeed, representing about 30% of the project cost in some cases. So getting the utilities, getting the footprint of our city right, not just above the ground but below the ground, is a strong focus of our organisation. So I'm going to round out here with my top 3 takeaways. As always, I love threes. So I'd probably share with you, from my experience from planning to delivery, the importance of a vision, of alignment and collaboration. And you cannot underestimate the importance of bringing people to the table, but alignment around thinking and alignment around place, having a strong focus on place rather than a series of services or pieces of infrastructure. My second point would be around the need for government to be proactive and pragmatic, and probably now more than ever there is a need for us to take the lead, to de-risk and to set the vision for all of us to work towards. And last but absolutely not least, I call it windows of opportunity, but the need to adapt to times. You just cannot set and forget. We need to evolve the thinking, evolve the narrative, evolve the priorities within our Parkland City to meet the needs of the time and certainly our citizens. So thanks everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you a bit about our 3 cities and our tale from here.
Oh, thank you to Dr. Sarah Hill, who is live streaming from Sydney and talked about the challenges and opportunity inherent in planning form in Sydney and how to build a new city under 3 ambitions that is green, connected and features advanced industry skills and research ecosystems. And all this, of course, with a real focus on delivery of outcomes. Great final wrap up from her about vision, alignment and collaboration, needing a proactive and pragmatic government, and adapting to the times, be agile and responsive to what's going on. So another round of applause, please, for Dr. Sarah Hill. Now, whether it's New Zealand, the UK or Australia, there is no shortage of insight and opinions on the best course forward. So our next panel brings together what has been discussed today with some of the experts who understand the intersection of the natural environment, the built environment, and all the policies and systems in between. So they're going to have a chance to go deep on the key issues that we have to tackle as we try to reorient our resource management system to aim for outcomes. So if you please welcome our panel.
Right, so I'm armed here with questions, so if you post questions on the app, they'll come up and I can ask them. Otherwise, I'm armed here with a list of questions that I've pre-prepared, pre-structured. They're my thoughts on what I want answers on. If you want something else, you're going to have to post it. Okay?
You're going to
Thank you.
introduce everybody?
Yes, I'll just introduce people as we're going through. So, look, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you all. We've put a panel together here because you reflect different aspects of the resource management system. So whether that's infrastructure and delivery and housing, which is Patrick's charge, Gary, your passion for the environment and for the social outcomes that we're delivering in your history with the EDS, Lesley, in terms of implementing or providing advice to government and also providing advice to local government on how to run the system. And Daniel, with your experience working particularly in the legal system itself, but also working and advocating for a lot of infrastructure providers. So we thought it would be a good opportunity to canvass a number of questions from you about the challenges that you see with the system. And I thought maybe what I would do is give an opening question. We've heard a lot today about some of the pressures that infrastructure and delivering infrastructure is providing and the environmental outcomes. We've heard about the pressures of climate change and the need that we need in terms of response to COVID. And I would just like observations from each of you, and if I can start with you, Patrick, at that end and work our way through, on how you see what the big challenges are in the areas that you're working in terms of the current system, and you know, what's your challenge in terms of delivering what you're looking to deliver in terms of infrastructure.
Great, thanks, Amelia. I've also been asked to just do a little introduction at the start, is that right?
Yeah, go for it.
Yes, so Patrick Dougherty with Kāinga, and my role there is General Manager of Construction and Innovation, and I lead the public housing construction program. But I guess I should probably also start with my experience goes back, because I'm a grandfather, so I'm pretty old, 35 plus years in the development game, spending 25 years of those in the private mezzanine funded residential development sector. So I've got some experience across about 12 years in public housing, as well as 25 years in the private. In terms of your question about some of the challenges, I guess having been around when the 91 Act actually came about, I actually sadly remember the adjustment that we had to go through. And I feel that the biggest challenge that I've seen is going from the Town Planning Act approach that we had prior to the 91 Act coming out. We never really adjusted, well, didn't for many, many years, adjust in how that was actually administered. And so we ended up going into an effects-based approach, but with a compliance approach. And so the struggle that we've continually had in the industry trying to get things built is having the confidence to know that what was going to happen through the process was something that we could actually forecast. And it was always a bit of a guess. And because of that, it stunted so much investment in so many development areas. That's probably the first point I'd start with, Amelia.
Thank you.
Kia ora tātou. I'd like to start with the bigger picture. It's important to remember that these islands we lived in were formed about 80 million years ago. They evolved a unique flora and fauna, free from any mammalian predators. And about 800 years ago, the first peoples arrived, and with them the first pulse of extinctions. And then a second wave of people arrived, and a second and more traumatic pulse of extinctions occurred. And so today, only 10% of the wetlands that were habitat to so many of our bird species are left in New Zealand. About 20% of our coastal forests are left, which were once teeming with bird life. Biodiversity is still tanking across many indicators, and something like 4,000 species are at or near extinction today. Many of our fabulous unique bird species have gone altogether. So my contention here is that when we talk about resource management system reform, we need to think about our natural heritage. The legislation that's proposed is a Natural and Built Environments Act. And in many ways, I think that nature is infrastructure. It just depends on how you look at it and where you draw the margins between them. So I think that collectively as people here, 800 years, 80 million years of evolution, we've now got a responsibility. We've got good science now. We know what we've done, and I think we've got the wit and the will to fix it. And so that's why I think this legislation is as much about planning the restoration of that lost natural heritage, of doing landscape scale restoration with philanthropic and volunteer effort across New Zealand, and with business support across New Zealand, as it is about addressing the urgent social problems and inequities in our cities.
Thanks, Gary.
Kia ora, everyone. Unlike Gary, I do need to introduce myself, I think. I'm Lesley, Baddon, and I work for the Ministry for the Environment. I work at the Auckland office. I'm part of a group of government agencies who work together principally on Auckland issues and on urban. I had the joyful task of running around after the panel, pretty much doing what I was told, occasionally offering an opinion and mostly getting it batted down, but that's fine, that's what I do for a living. In terms of the challenge for me, I have to go, I'm afraid, right down to the regulatory framework that McVeagh and I have responsibility for administering. And I think the real challenge that I see is that we do absolutely need, and for the reasons that Gary's outlined, for both, I think, the built and the natural environment, a real modern fit-for-purpose regulatory system. And that's one that I think means a much better relationship between government, market, community than the RME has produced. And I think one of the things we all learned with the panel approach was that if you looked at the purpose and principles, I think it was very clear on the role of Maori in the system. It looked really good in principle, and we talked to lots of people who said there's nothing wrong with the RMA, it's just what people do with it, they just don't do the right thing. Well, for me, that's not a good regulatory framework, because it has to work and it has to be usable by people and understood by people. And I think that's a big challenge. Certainly, MFE and I have.
Thanks, Lesley. Daniel.
Kia ora, everyone. Daniel Minhinnick. I'm a partner at McVeagh in the Environment and Planning area. For me, a large part of how we're involved in helping our clients is in helping them achieve something and building something and getting across the need for change. And so I think it's quite interesting as far as what Dean and Amelia were saying earlier, as far as the move away from the protection of the status quo. I see that as being a really important step change, particularly when you look at urban environments and the protection effectively given to amenity values. I see moving away from that static approach and towards recognition of the need to change being a really important leg up for development and infrastructure. Equally, I see that change being really important as far as helping with the restoration of our natural environments. And I think, stepping back, I think that the panel needs to really be applauded for what they've achieved through the report. I think that they have, in a reasonably short space of time, produced a really comprehensive report. It's not, though, a panacea. I think there are some adjacencies, particularly around local government and funding, that really need to be explored. And in that sense, it is a little bit of a shame that we do have this segregation at the moment, as far as all of us in this room talking about the planning system and everyone else downstairs talking about funding and financing. And then I think the other aspect, though, which also goes to that status quo aspect, is the cultural and resourcing challenges that our local government faces, and the way that manifests when developers or the infrastructure community then interact with local government.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm going to, now, these guys may have seen a few of my questions in advance, but they are going to have seen these ones because these have come from the floor. And Gary, I'd like to start with you because I know you've been involved a lot in engagement with communities as you've got work through with EDS. But the question has come through, does the panel have a view on the need to strengthen iwi governance? So perhaps Gary and maybe Lesley, you'd have a comment to that as well.
Well, I think the panel had a view on that, and I guess it's one that was entirely consistent with the Environmental Defence Society's position, so it must have been a good position. And that is that there does need to be a strengthening of the ties between the treaty and the new resource management system. We need to get away from tokenism. I think that means that we need to start thinking, or not thinking, but implementing co-governance, that we need to have strong mana whenua involvement in plan making, in decision making about plans, and you know, I think that's just the way of the future. That's our New Zealandness. coming into play, isn't it?
Yeah. And Lesley, maybe you could provide a bit of comment on the capacity of Māori for that transition, because I know that's something that we've been talking about from the panel discussion side, and just from where, if MFE has any perspective on that as well, in making that kind of transition.
Yeah, I think there's a general understanding now that there needs to be an increase in capability and capacity across the system, and for Māori to participate the way the panel's proposals is intended, and certainly I think the way the government's thinking, then that has to be supported and that has to be funded. It's not going to happen without that. I think there's still a question about how that happens, and I think the principle that it should happen is definitely part of the process.
Excellent. Okay, maybe another general one, and this time we'll start Daniel and work that way. Look, we've made a number of recommendations from the panel's perspective about opportunities, setting outcomes and targets, but I'd be interested in exploring whether, from your perspective, there's any risks or threats in that model and that approach, and whether there is anything that sort of gives you pause for thought in terms of challenges going forward.
Certainly. So I think that one of the key challenges is that with the 20-odd outcomes that have been identified by the panel, there's a question about how you prioritise those. I think that inevitably there will be tensions and conflicts between those outcomes and what they each aspire to, and how those are reconciled will be a key issue. Otherwise, you effectively are over-promising and under-delivering. And so, from that perspective, I think wearing a development or infrastructure hat, I think there is a significant risk that it will end up with the ecological bottom lines inevitably prevailing and those outcomes prevailing. And so while the strategic planning aspects of the new framework will assist from an infrastructure perspective, I think, as Hamish mentioned this morning, I think there is a real risk that when it comes to how a planned infrastructure project goes against those outcomes, there's the real risk that there'll be major issues there.
Excellent. Thank you. Right of reply or other comments from others in terms of that risk?
Well, it just sounded a bit deja vu, Daniel. I thought you sounded a bit pre-King Salmon in your comments. I mean, isn't the whole idea that we have environmental bottom lines or biophysical limits that are set and that you can't go below, and then the market does its thing above them?
Yeah, and I think on that there is what might be the limits. There's also then a question of how aspirational they might be, and also when you come to the outcomes, which are not necessarily linked to absolute bottom lines, but there will be tensions between those and how those outcomes still play out. I still think that there are real risks from that perspective.
Okay.
That could take another half an hour, I think, to resolve, but we'll leave it here.
Well, it gives us a flavour of some of the challenges, and I do think it is really important to go, we're certainly, as I think Dean indicated, the panel make the recommendations, we have to go through what that looks like, and I think it is perhaps optimistic, and I thought Jacinda's comment this morning really resonated. If there was a silver bullet to this issue, just as there is a silver bullet to infrastructure provision as an issue, I think we would have landed on it, because we've been worrying about this for a while, and I don't think it's going to get rid of all of those tensions, but I think they're reasonable concerns. Patrick, turning to you, the Urban Development Act in July this year gave you new powers your agency, new powers in self-consenting, not you directly, one hopes. Given the new role, I just wondered if you had any observations or comments on how that system, how the existing system and that system might progress a bit, or where your opportunities are there in terms of change.
I guess the first thing I do is acknowledge that it does sometimes come across in the feedback I'm hearing. It looks like Kāinga is being treated differently than other players. But the intention is actually to be quite different. In fact, this is not so much about Kāinga having powers that allows it to develop its development program. It's actually to enable development to occur with the support of what the Act allows to occur. The example that we use the best is probably Hobsonville Point, which was ex-defence land, and the work with Waitakere Council and the Crown through the subsidiary of Housing New Zealand at the time, Hobsonville Land Company, arriving at a plan and a master plan from which the development as we see now before us is quite an impressive example of medium density, which is really showcasing how medium density can apply through the rest of the city. That is the sort of thing we expect to see come out of that with the SDPs that can be created. In terms of how Kāinga might looking to use it for itself, it's actually not the intent. We are, I guess, stepping very much into understanding. If you go to Kāinga's name, it's called Kāinga Homes and Communities, and one of the key tasks that have been described in legislation, this is the one that set us up on the 1st of October last year, was to enable thriving communities. And so when we look at the powers that the Urban Development Act has created, it's actually expecting us to create ways to work in partnership with communities quite differently. I heard a previous speaker in this session talk about the change from doing things to communities and doing things with communities, and I think that's the key shift in terms of the attitude that needs to be applied. The vast majority of activity that Kāinga actually will undertake is typically within existing district plan provisions for itself, and when it does need to go outside that, it'll look to follow those processes. And as I say, the issues that the Urban Development Act is trying to resolve are ones that are much bigger that happen in the marketplace than just what's happening within the public housing space.
Thanks for that, Patrick. There's a question here from the floor which I think actually sort of mirrors my final question, but is better worded, so I'm going to use it. Many today see the RMA reform as a panacea for righting all the wrongs in New Zealand's economic and environmental prosperity. And I think that's a fair observation. What one element of reform do you see as making the most difference in making things positive difference? What's the one thing in the reforms in your mind that is the most positive opportunity to address that? I will go. Anyone can have a go.
Can I just be me and not, yeah. I think the Strategic Planning Act is the one that really could make the difference if it's done well. And I think that's the thing about the reforms. They need good ideas, good outcomes, objectives, but actually making sure it works. It's my previous point. But I think the Strategic Planning Act is where we've got the opportunity to really reset the system so that far more gets decided further up, that there is a far longer term, bigger, picking up Gary's ideas about the sorts of intergenerational thinking we should be doing. If you look at the pressures that the current system has, it's a big risk because it's brand new and it's an insertion into a system that's not used to these things, and we've got a lot to work through, but I think that's the thing that could really make the long-term biggest difference.
Thanks, Lesley.
Yeah, I agree with that. I was going to say that. I think Hamish laid out the case for spatial planning this morning, but I think his problem was with the architecture of the legislation, having a separate spatial planning act. Well, I think that train has left the station, and he needs to get over it because there's no way. I mean, that is the train, and it's got momentum. Lesley can no doubt tell us more about the timeline, but my expectation is that will be in at least 2 new acts of Parliament during this term, 2 new acts during this term. Drafting has started. You're not going to change the fundamental architecture. Where we need to get our act together as a joined-up community, and I mean, EDS was really pleased to work with Infrastructure New Zealand and EMA and Business New Zealand and the others to get the political mandate for these reforms essentially landed, and very keen to continue that work. But it's going to be now focusing on the second and third order details of how we can make the fundamental architecture work. And that's where I think there is devil in the detail around spatial planning, the connectivity with the funding side of things. But spatial planning is definitely the big game in town. I reckon it's the big game breaker. And I think if I was going to add something to that, I'd say local government reform. Too many local councils. You know, we've got one council with 1.5 million people in Auckland. We've got another council with, I don't know, 30,000 people in Mackenzie district. I mean, those junctions are just, ridiculous, and we need to get over ourselves.
And look, I know that was something that the panel did turn its mind to quite hard, and I know that the Planning Institute themselves looked a bit disappointed that we didn't have spatial planning in the main act, because I think it provided the panacea, perhaps, of one ring to rule them all, but what it didn't do was address how were we going to bring the issues you raised, Daniel, how we were going to bring funding and financing in. And I think if we went down that path, that was going to be a very difficult avenue to get one piece of legislation covering all of that, where a spatial planning process might be able to tackle it.
Yeah, one brief comment on spatial planning. I completely agree. I think the other thing, particularly from an infrastructure perspective, is that the focus is very much on corridors, and so it's very much about roading and three waters. And I think looking forward, and you hear of the policy goal of going to 100% renewable, for example, some of those standalone pieces of infrastructure in terms of energy and social infrastructure, having those identified, particularly in the context of the bottom lines and the raft of environmental outcomes sought to be achieved as well, bringing those into the spatial planning process will be critical as well if we're able to deliver on the outcomes from an infrastructure perspective.
And you very nicely answered another question here, which was, and I'll give you an opportunity just to add to it if you wanted to. The question about decarbonising our economy is going to need significant renewable infrastructure, and you've just touched on some of it. And how could the system balance the need for those good impacts on the environment with the neighbour development impact issues? And I think that spatial planning, to me, as you just suggested, is a key mechanism there. But do you have any other comments on that?
Yeah, and I guess just building on that without being built into that strategic planning aspect, there's the real risk that unanticipated major infrastructure will just fail to get through the Natural and Built Environments Act. Yeah. And so you look at something like a pumped hydro or something like that, unless it was signalled through a strategic planning act and then the combined plan, a real risk that it would actually require specific enabling legislation to actually get through.
Yeah, assuming that you think of those things as static in time, but yes, yeah, I think that's a fair comment. Does anyone else want to add to that, Gary or Patrick, anything?
I just wanted to sort of finish my comment off with the issue that we really have to face is something I mentioned at the very start is when we go into an outcomes-focused approach, that we need to make sure the work we do on agreeing what those outcomes are is done. And it has to be, like Gary said, across the entire community. There has to be an agreed way of dealing with this, and that was the challenge that I was referring to when we had the RMA came out, and we didn't actually have an accepted approach that was across the entire industry. And so the work that is required of us now is to get that in place. It's all very well, to Lesley's point, having the legislation change, but it's going to be failure if we don't actually put in place how it's actually created. And so when I think about the difference in my simple way, we have to continue to protect what we needed to protect in the past, but this is about planning for the future, whereas the RMA seemed to be more focused on protecting what we had. So when you came into a community and said you wanted to build a 5-storey apartment building next to some single-level houses, that was never going to succeed if you're going to operate under the old way. But it may be that we have to see what is the future meant to look like, and allows us to have that kind of thinking in our spatial planning.
Yeah, and you raise a really good point there, Patrick, and I know Daniel and I have had a bit of a conversation about this, but Lesley, it'd be good to give you an opportunity to respond as well, about the degree of culture change needed in our system, and certainly that was something that, for my sins, saw the transition from 1990 to 1991, and all the lack of transition and how that worked from a culture perspective. Daniel, do you have any comments about that from an issue perspective, and then maybe give Lesley a chance to think about what MFE is considering?
Certainly. It's, I think the panel's report identifies the resourcing, the capability and capacity challenges for local government, and unless that is grappled with, we'll, as an infrastructure industry, continue to face a number of the same battles we are today, under a different acronym as far as what the legislation is. And so grappling with that, and I don't know whether the government has the same inclination on that aspect as it does on the legislative framework side of things, but that's critical from my perspective.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's 30 years of a particular sort of culture, and that didn't start. There was a lot that came through from the Town and Country Planning Act before that. I think that's one of our biggest challenges, and that is something that, as I was saying before, with regulation, it's got to work with the environment that it's in, but also at times it's got to drive the change. And we've got a very litigious, a very complicated, very devolved kind of environment, and a lot of set expectations to work with. One of the things the Minister is looking at is the potential to be producing, and we're calling it model plans because we're not sure exactly where they would be, but there's the potential to find at least one and potentially two places in New Zealand that are ready to work with us as we're developing the legislation, so that we can actually road test it as we go. So it's quite a different approach, and it will take resources to do, but I think it will be something really important. What was really missing from the RMA in terms of any kind of guidance, Minister Park has been really clear. One of his big gaps with the RMA was that there was nothing that looked like a plan for anybody to work to. So he's quite keen that by the time we finish the process, there's something that looks pretty much doable, at least one example to work with.
And maybe that's a call for us as well as leaders in the industry. This is the opportunity that we have to sort of drive some of that culture change as well. Perhaps another a reverse question in terms of
could I do a culture change piece? I mean, I think you've touched on it. You know, we've got some very ambitious climate change goals, both 2030 and 2050. We're on a pathway to decarbonise our economy, and all the people at this conference have a role to play in that. And I think we need to start thinking about, you know, the kind of infrastructure that helps with that. You know, electrifying the transport fleet, fantastic, let's get on with it. I mean, that's low-hanging fruit in terms of CO2 emission reductions. And I just think, you know, the way we manage fresh water is another sort of thing that we need to, you know, have very much in mind. We've got freshwater reforms coming through. We've got the Three Waters reforms coming through. There's a truckload of infrastructure bill to go on there to fix it. And then finally, with respect to sort of spatial planning, let's remember that the panel also recommended that it should go out into the coastal marine area. Yes. So it's also about our oceans. And guess what? The Minister for the Environment is now the Minister for Oceans and Fisheries. So there's going to be more change over this 3-year term than certainly I've ever seen. And I was around in 1991.
Thank you for that. Look, we actually, I still have a few more questions from the audience, which I'm probably not going to have time to get through, but I know people will be happy to stand around and answer those questions directly, so if people want to come up. But Lesley, I did want to just give you the opportunity, and I know that your role is advising the government into action and what areas they're focusing on, but I wondered if you could give us some insight, and Gary alluded to his understanding of that, on what you're thinking, where you're going, what priorities and advice you've been asked, just to get a sense of timing for change.
Well, Gary probably knows more than me. So, Minister Parker, I had some 4 Ps in my head because my memory's not that great. Pace, so as he's indicated, he wants everything done and dusted this parliamentary term. I still wish it was 4 years instead of 3, my goodness. The UK one at 5 was good. Secondly, he wants to push ahead with the Natural and Built Act, as he calls it, and very, very quickly. So things are happening in that. The Strategic Planning Act, he also wants done in the same time frame. However, we're looking at the moment about different forms of vehicle for delivering that legislation, and that's using the new Public Services Act provisions. Now, we're not sure if that's going to work, but chief executives across the system, so the ones in particular that are affected by the Strategic Planning Act, are already working together looking at potential models. So that's where the Public Services Act is new. This would be the first one up. And it's about addressing some of the kind of silos that central government agencies tend to work in. So this is a perfect proposal for it. There's just a question about how much or little would be in that sort of process and how much would still be driven solely by MFE with people helping. The second thing is partnership. So the panel were very clear, and Gary's raised the words co-governance, but the principle of the new approach is around a far better, more realistic, well, meaningful partnership around decision making. And we're recommending that's built into the process of developing the legislation itself. So those are the 3 Ps: Public Services Act, PACE, and the partnership. And all of those add up to quite a problem, my last P, in the time that we've got. So we're really working that through, and we're being very active. There's lots of conversations going along. The role of local government's another one. I see the potential for developing those model plans as being a real working relationship that we can do. Yeah, so that's where we're at the moment. In terms of process, in terms of the participation, that was the another P. I think the minister's of the view, and I think he's made it clear that there's been a lot of discussion about the need for change. The panel report included conversations right across the country. So his view is that we go straight ahead into the legislative process, and there's a couple, at least one, select committee, really thorough select committee processes, and that's where the focus for participation would be, and that's where, if I were in this room and not me, I would be thinking about putting my resources.
So people should take the brave step of reading that tome?
Yes, Amelia will remember the Minister Barker was very keen that we actually printed them. We were really good with recycled paper and things, but he felt it was really important to have a solid, obvious report. Cool. As a train.
Doorstop.
Yeah, I call it a height improver. I stand on it to reach cupboards.
It's good with Zoom calls.
Yeah, but look, I mean, I think the point is we can expect change. We can expect change quite soon, which is good because we've been talking about it for a long time. And I suppose today's been a bit of an entree to what that change will look like. But and there will be opportunities to participate. But it sounds like it's going to be a roller coaster ride in terms of the pace that he's looking for. Okay, well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining me. And as I said, thank you for the questions. There's still 3 or 4 on the pad here, and really happy to hang around and try and answer them, and cobble a few others here who I'm sure will do that as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. That's great. Oh, that was really fascinating. Thank you all very much. Gosh, that really did stand out for me, that there's a damning list of extinctions that Gary went over. And that notion of nature as infrastructure was awesome. The need to change, need to engage more effectively with EU was a strong message that came out. Co-governance on planning and decision making, that this is key. And more widely, of course, a reiteration that things need to be done with and not to communities. And ending on that note that we can expect change, and we can expect it soon, albeit with something of a roller coaster ride. So ladies and gentlemen, please, another round of applause on Planning and Implementing Outcomes panel. Gary Taylor, Daniel Minhinnick, Lesley Baddon, Patrick Dougherty, moderated by Amelia, Linzey. So I have a couple of notes for you all e te whānau, which is that you're going to get a push notification if you haven't already on your phones, letting you know what your table number is. You can receive the information via email. If you have any, you can choose to have it by email otherwise. If you have any troubles with this, just go to the registration desk and they'll sort you out. Also on your lanyards, you have Uber discount codes. I think there's probably like the third card in. Just have a good look at that, because there is a code on there that you need to enter under the promotions in the Uber app to give you what will be a $20 voucher times 2. So we also have a shuttle bus. We have these discount vouchers for Uber. We really want to make sure that there's absolutely no need whatsoever for any drinking or driving tonight. Now, while you have your apps there and available, please open that and answer the question there. It's under poll 3B. And while you're doing that, so what's the main challenge that the resource management reforms need to address? While you're doing that, let's look ahead to the afternoon session. Reforming Water will be emceed by Peter Reedy, a newly minted Foreign Affairs Minister, will address us. It's understood, of course, that part of Nanaia Mahuta's appointment to that role came about due to the way that she handled the water reforms. So we'll hear from her on that. Tony Kelly from Taswater will be here, as well as Bill Bayfield and Mayor Gurananan. And then we'll be winding up the day with National's Andrew Bailey. So here are our results for that poll. Looks like they're mostly through. So the main challenge that the resource management reforms need to address is by far a bias towards status quo and lack of emphasis on benefits or positive outcomes. And the others, as you can see, are moving slightly there. Complexity, cost and lack of government capacity, not too far behind on 34%. In fact, now approaching that 38 number for our third answer down. Thanks for that, everybody. That's wonderful to have your feedback on that. We're going to take a break now for morning tea, actually slightly early, afternoon tea. Afternoon tea will be served at 3 o'clock, and then if we can just make sure that we're all back into our session again at 3:30. But thanks again for all of our speakers in our panel this afternoon.